After the February Revolution in 1917, the Tsar system had fallen, but yet there was a power vacuum in Russia. There were two powers, dual authority. There was Kerensky's, firstly Prince Lvov's, provisional government of 12 members, and there was the Soviets, with its power centralized in the Petrograd Soviet. Elections, while scheduled, were never held. Heading into October 1917, things had reached its boiling point. Both sides would go in, but only one would live to see 1918.
After the February Revolution, the provisional government was set up to run the day-to-day activities taking part in Russia. However, it had three weaknesses even before it could be allowed to make decisions on Russia. One of its weaknesses was that it wasn't elected, so it was illegitimate. The provisional government was meant to be a temporary measure. However, it continually delayed elections, which led to critics claiming that it was trying to hold on to power. Another weakness for the provisional government was the Petrograd Soviet, made up of over 3,000 members. Now, this body was elected, so they did have legitimate authority to claim to power in Russia. They also passed many laws and issued Soviet Order No. 1, which weakened the power of the provisional government. Soviet Order No. 1 also stated that the reforms issued by the provisional government were only to be accepted in such situations where they did not go against the wishes of the Petrograd Soviet. Another problem for the provisional government was that it inherited the social and economic problems caused by World War I and could therefore be blamed for its failure to not solve these issues. While in power, provisional government did make several reforms to try and improve the situation in Russia. One of these was the release of political prisoners and the granting of freedom of the press, but this worked against the provisional government by allowing opponents to criticise their actions. Another mistake by the provisional government was the disbanding of Ukraina, which was a secret police organisation which meant they could not monitor political opponents such as Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks.
Did you just say Lenin? Well, Lenin arrived back in Russia on April 7th to deliver his infamous April Theses. In this thesis, he outlined 10 clear points that give the Bolsheviks a clear vision for the future. He said that dual authority could not work and that he would not cooperate with the Bolsheviks. This was a big success for Lenin, as it removed him from the tainting disaster that was the provisional government and its many mistakes. Also, in his April Theses, Lenin outlined two clearly influential slogans for the Bolsheviks. Peace, bread, land. This appealed to the soldiers stuck in the trenches with peace, to the workers starving in the cities with bread, and to the peasants farming on the landowner's land with land. As well as this, Lenin also proclaimed all power to the Soviets. Lenin recognized that these elected bodies were where the true power lay. In fact, the Bolsheviks would be the only party truly dedicated to the Soviets. This won him the support of all of the lower classes in Russia.
One of the main problems in Russia was that it was still at war with Germany in 1917. However, there would be a problem for the provisional government, as pulling out of the war would mean that they would lose the foreign aid that they relied on from the Western countries. So they were in an impossible situation of having to stay in the war, but in that case it was ruining its chance of survival, as many soldiers and all the people in Russia were all against the war with Germany. In June 1917, the Provisional Government launched a major offensive against the German armies on the southwest front, known as the June Offensive. It failed badly, with whole regiments mutinying and deserting, which was partly encouraged by Bolshevik propaganda. The failure of the June Offensive led to splits in the government, and Kornilov believed that the Provisional Government should be focusing its attention on dealing with revolutionary opposition within Russia, such as the Bolsheviks. One very important figure, Alexander Kerensky, became the war minister for the Provisional Government in 1917. However, he was not only a member of the Provisional Government, but also a member of the Petrograd Soviet. Now, he aimed to strengthen ties with the Petrograd Soviet by inviting members of the SRs and the Mensheviks into his government. But however, the one thing this did do, as this led to a loss of trust by the Russian people in the Mensheviks and the SRs, as they were seen as joining with the enemy, and this allowed the Bolsheviks to gain support.
The problem we've not yet addressed is the land problem. See, After the February Revolution, many peasants had hoped that the huge estates owned by the Tsar, the nobility and the clergy would be divvied up and returned to them, that they would get some land for themselves. But this did not occur, and many peasants acted on their own behalf, seizing land. In response to this, the government set up the Land Commission, attempting to find a solution to this. However, the Land Commission delayed its conclusion again and again, as many in the provisional government did not want to lose their own land. The peasants, clearly upset by this, began to desert the army in droves, rushing home to claim land. Ever the opportunist, Lenin and his Bolshevik party took advantage of this unresolved crisis. He thought that the peasants seizing land were acting on behalf of the revolution, and he stole the Social Revolutionaries' land policy, proclaiming all land to the peasants. This enticed many to his cause in the countryside and unleashed absolute anarchy for yet again the provisional government to deal with. This allowed a huge surge in support for the Bolsheviks and strengthened Lenin's position. By the summer of 1917, the provisional government's authority was beginning to break down. The Soviets, the trade unions, worker control in factories, the peasant seizures of land, and the creation of independent national minorities government showed the provisional government was losing control of events. In July, there were widespread demonstrations in Petrograd in response to the failed June offensive. These were known as the July Days. Some individuals in the Bolshevik party played a part in the July Days, but Lenin quickly played down their role. He did not want the Bolsheviks to be held responsible for a rising that had failed so miserably. Instead, he put the blame for the July Days on the SRs and the Mensheviks. The provisional government successfully put down the July Day demonstrations. The crisis clearly showed the ineffectiveness of opposition groups at this time, as they lacked common aims and objectives. It also showed the provisional government, despite its failings, could still maintain control at this point. Kerensky now took this opportunity to suppress the Bolshevik party. Many Bolshevik members were imprisoned, such as Leon Trotsky. However, Lenin managed to flee to Finland, and many key leaders remained free. The failure of the provisional government to decisively deal with the Bolsheviks was the true mistake. Soon, there was an issue, and the Kornilov affair began. General Kornilov, who was in charge of the disastrous June offensive, began to concoct an idea in his head. He rightfully assumed that the Petrograd Soviet and the Bolsheviks were undermining the provisional government's authority, and he decided to march on the capital to relieve them and to protect the government. Alexander Kerensky, unsure of what was happening, saw this as a threat to the government itself and Kornilov's attempt to restore Tsarist rule. Because of this, he released the Red Guard who had been in prison and armed them, with Leon Trotsky the head of it all. Kornilov was not able to take Petrograd, and the Red Guard and the Bolsheviks in general were seen as the defenders of the revolution, as heroes. This served to massively weaken the provisional government, and Kornilov himself would later say that this was the precursor to the October Revolution.
Vladimir Lenin was inspired by his use of timing in the October Revolution. He knew that the Bolsheviks had to seize power before the Constituent Assembly elections, as he knew they were still a small party, and then he knew that they weren't going to do very well in the elections. Lenin also had to make sure that the Bolsheviks' rising coincided with the meeting of the All-Russian Congress of Soviets, to make sure that they were acting on the behalf of the Soviets. Now, the War Minister, Kerensky, as already mentioned, heard about this, and so he ordered a preemptive attack on the Bolsheviks. And now Lenin felt like he had no choice but to go through with the revolution that took place in October and was managed by Leon Trotsky. While Vladimir Lenin was the ideas, Leon Trotsky was the main organizer of the October Revolution. He planned it perfectly. He became the president of the Petrograd Soviet in September 1917, and this allowed him to create the MRC and the Red Guards, which were in charge of securing the Bolshevik control during the revolution on the 27th of October. Now, what Trotsky did is he planned the revolution by seizing key buildings in Petrograd, and in 36 hours the provisional government had fallen and the Bolsheviks had secured control of key buildings such as the Winter Palace.
36 hours. The provisional government fell within 36 hours, having lasted just under 9 months. The Bolsheviks had assumed control, but it was not yet total control. Lenin would have to build a dictatorship.